Welcome back to CivilNet. I'm Patrick Elliott. I'm joined again by Eric Hacopian, a friend of the show and a friend of mine. Thanks for coming on, Eric.
Okay, nice to be here.
We're going to continue updating on the situation in Artsakh and now in southern Armenia. Can you give us an update of what's going on the ground? There's too many rumors going around. What do we know for sure?
Essentially, the final step in the genocide and ethnic cleansing started yesterday afternoon. Somewhere around noon, we started getting reports of the refugees making it through, coming through the Goris-Stepanakert highway. So far, we're up to 4,000 people that crossed. I expect that number to grow by 10, 15,000, if not more so today. And I want to go back on one point is people understand when we say ethnic cleansing, it's the same thing as genocide. So do not think there's a distinction. This is the final steps in the genocide, which is essentially the forced removal of people from their ancestral homeland. I expect that somewhere over the next weeks and months, 90-95% of Armenians that live in Artsakh will evacuate out of very tangible, real fear of persecution and murder by the Aliyev regime. So far, our systems have not been overwhelmed as far as being able to help people, but I expect that's coming soon because the numbers will be such that will be quite problematic in being able to deal with this many people with this many housing issues. Many of these people have relatives in Armenia, so that will mitigate some of it, but there's going to be a large number of people who don't, and hotels and things only go so far. So I think this is the immediate thing that we all need to be focused on, is taking care of these people on a human level.
I don't want to have to ask you this, but we know of at least 4 different villages that have been massacred by the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Talavard, Haterk, Vardadzor, Gyulatagh.
Mm-hmm.
What can you share with us? How do we know about this? What are the details? How did this word get out? And how do we make sure the word gets out?
How do we know about this? At this point, we're fairly certain that it happened. I call these our 4 bukas. Whatever happened in Buka, it happened in these villages. And what we know is actually the video evidence is put out by the other side on their own social media. They put it up on Facebook and on TikTok. The murdered children, wives, women, whatever they've done, people burned. They've put up these images themselves. So almost all the proof, all the initial proof that we had of these mass murders in these 4 villages came from Azeri social media, because they were posting it themselves. I'm assuming they're proud of it. The problem is that all of these areas are under the control of the Aliyev regime, and we have learned that they're actually trying to dispose of bodies, putting people down as missing persons, because there's no body, you're a missing person, you're not on some list of people murdered. So that's what's going on. And the third thing that happened here, which almost tells us definitively that this happened, was the murder of Russian peacekeepers. There were 2 sets of Russian peacekeepers that were shot and killed execution style. And these soldiers were either witnesses to these murders or were videotaping. There's 2 variations of these stories. But whatever it was, they were murdered, and they were apparently, if you look at the video, shot in close range in the head, execution style, not to be able to bring out the news of this thing. And by the way, this cover-up is their deeds are being covered up by the Russian state, which tells you the kind of country you're dealing with, in which your own soldiers are doing something righteous. In this case, when the Russian soldier has become demonized around the world because of the war in Ukraine, and you want to cover that story up of soldiers doing the right thing or trying to stop atrocities or trying to record them for prosecutorial purposes. That's the only reason you would do so. So that's where we're at with that. The last thing that's what I think will wrap this up as full evidence for future purposes is the fact that there are people who escaped these massacres who are crossing the border now. And I know there are efforts to identify them and get their stories. And so things like this, as much as you try to cover them up, they don't really stay covered up. It's just our job of aggressively pursuing them on a legal front, investigative on a legal front.
So Azeris are telling the world that Armenians can leave freely from Artsakh. There's rumors that they're separating the men from the women and the children. Can you say something on this subject?
Yes, there's two things there. Firstly, the first batch of people leaving yesterday was about 90% women and children. So the men were not coming out or were being held back. The second thing that we heard is that the Aliyev regime was putting qualifiers on people leaving. They had to declare themselves, if you're a male, you have to self-declare yourself a member of the Armenian Armed Forces, which is certainly not true. There are no members of the Armenian Armed Forces there, to be allowed to leave. The problem with that is they can use that as an excuse to arrest you. So what's concerning here about the men being held back is this is exactly the Srebrenica scenario in which they allowed women and children to leave, and then they killed every man over 14 years of age, every boy and man. So this is where all of our efforts need to go to not allow that to happen in this case. But as far as what they're saying and what they're doing, they're not, even though you hear conflicting things, there are men coming through, but they tend to be almost universally older men. So essentially, anyone under 50 or 60 that could have been participating in the first or second wars are going to be suspects. That could, any passage by them is a risk. That they could get arrested, disappeared, whatever, or their self-confession, which is their condition to leaving, used against them to suppress them. And this, by the way, the self-declaration, which they're forcing people to do, also would not allow you to ever go back. If there's ever an arrangement to go back, if you get all the men to declare themselves as members of a foreign army, women and children are not going to go back without the men. So this is actually a last tool on ethnic cleansing, where you get people to self-declare something, in many cases, which are not truthful or lies.
So there's lots of rumors going around about Russian political activities here in the Republic of Armenia. What do you see? Where's this going? What are the trends? What are some of the signs we should be looking out for?
I think it's very, very obvious that there's a concerted Russian state effort to attack Armenian statehood and independence. This is organized from everything from social media to some international social media people showing up here that work for the other side, for the Russian side, to some proxies here that were being activated. So far, they have failed. I think plan A was that you start this war, and as a reaction to the war, 100,000 people come out, they overrun the parliament, and you have a revolution. That didn't work. So I think they're going to move on to plan B, which is probably more nefarious tactics, I'm guessing.
What can you tell us about the speech that the Prime Minister gave, talking about Armenia's foreign policy shift?
Well, I mean, that's the Rubicon that he crossed it yesterday. He said the country is going to join the ICC, that essentially the Armenia is going to join the West, in so many words, and pretty much ended any semblance of a ally-type relationship with Russia that no longer exists. Not that it has existed for years, to be honest. But I think the fact that the Russian state right now is actually actively and directly going after this country, this regime, and him personally, I think that he figured that there's no downside to doing so, because what is there to lose when they're trying to murder you openly? And that's what they're advocating. I think there's a key thing that we have to understand. At this point, frankly, the prime minister is not relevant. And what I mean by that is, in the case, if there are people that are attacking Armenia's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, that's is a unifying thing for us. It should have nothing to do with who the prime minister is. You can love the prime minister, you can hate the prime minister, and you'll have damn good reasons to hate him for what's gone on in the last couple of weeks or years. But it doesn't. That should never be an excuse for us to allow foreign countries or agents to attack our statehood, independence, and national sovereignty. I don't want to put a qualifier in this. I am not saying that every person who's demonstrating against this current government is part of some plot. That's absolutely not true.
No, certainly not.
But certain elements are, which is quite natural, and it's nothing unusual. But I just want to make sure that people understand that there's many people that have very good raw emotions and are angry for all the right reasons, and we need to differentiate between the two.
Yeah, for sure. But to the credit of the Armenian people, I mean, I've always said this after the war, is that the 2020 war, is that the difference between us and the neighbors, that the neighbor was so shocked by the defeat, and this was, of course, before the era of social media where they can see the atrocities that they gleefully put online for us to see, but that they gave the keys to their wealth, their sovereignty, their futures to a single family that's been ruling with an iron fist ever since. Armenians calmly lined up, they went to choose their leader. And you can kind of still see that today, whereas people are protesting, they're exercising the democratic right to do so. And I do what I like to call the taxi driver test. So when you talk to the taxi drivers, right, and generally speaking, nobody's buying it. Everyone is pretty much aware this is a Russian plot. As you said, there's a lot of people who are rightfully angry, but I suspect the shock will pass. But I think everyone is pretty clear that this is a small group of people that are trying to orchestrate a power shift that we didn't ask for.
It's a foreign power.
Yeah.
I know. I mean, the Russian position, if it was zero, now it's less than zero, and their attempts simply are just not working. But that's also worrying, which means that they'll take measures that are not involved in persuading people.
Yeah. Before we conclude, I actually wanted to ask you, this is a recent development. Have you watched Alen Simonyan's, the Speaker of Parliament, interview on Lured 1 yesterday?
No, I have not.
So whereas the Prime Minister was a little bit more, measured in his speech, Mr. Simonyan really pulled no punches. He very clearly was calling out Russia. He laid out the entire situation, which was very interesting because you can kind of see like the balancing act that they're trying to do, where the prime minister is trying to maintain some kind of, but the speakers, there's definitely some interesting developments going on in Armenia. Based on all that, what do you think Armenia should do now? I mean, how do we recover from this? How do we build a future for ourselves and our homeland?
First and foremost is to deal with the humanitarian needs of people that are escaping genocide in Artsakh. That should be on top of everyone's agenda and should be a unifying theme. Secondly is the defense of Armenia's territorial integrity. At this point, that is the most important thing, because our enemies are going to move on to the Sunnic question, talk about the corridor and set up scenarios that gives them an excuse or make a made-up excuse to attack Armenia's territorial integrity. So that's the second thing. But third is, we are in this position because we're poor, not as poor as we were before. We're weak and we're isolated, not as isolated as we were before. So the thing to do is to focus on the three nevers, never to be poor, isolated, and militarily weak. And everything starts with economic development and having the ability. And Armenia, that has a per capita income of 20,000, has a much better capacity to defend itself and its interests, and all Armenians everywhere, than an Armenia of 2018 that had a per capita income of 4,000. Economic development is the base of all this, and we need to be laser focused on that. Integration into the world and upgrading the military. It's the 1, 2, 3. Nothing else matters. Everything else, I don't say it matters. It's everything else is secondary. Those are the three things that we need to focus on in a laser type manner. And I think over time we can overcome these issues. But at the same time, we should not fool ourselves. These are some of the darkest days in our history. They're not insurmountable, but these are some of the darkest days in our history. And you know, this is my standard. Before this invasion, for 8 months, you know, there's 30,000 children in Artsakh. Let's just count the children. A regime that everyone knows is an utter horror, sort of a monstrosity of wickedness, was given the right by the world to starve 30,000 Armenian children to death. And not a single country or a leader condemned the country or its leader for doing so. Let me ask you a question. If there was 30,000 dogs that were abandoned in an island someplace, what would they have done? I would guarantee you the response would not have been silent. This is where we're at. It's very hard and harsh to say it, but our job is to put a price on the life of every Armenian, starting with our children.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks again for joining us at ＳիվիլՆեթ. I'm Patrick, and we will update you as soon as we know more.